we throw it open, so please.
I mean, there are so many things I want to say, but the first thing is I don't understand why we are presenting this as an either-or solution. You know, it's either we do humanitarian work and we write checks, which is very easy to do in faraway places like Lebanon, or we bring people home. You know,
it's what do you mean home? Bring people home?
For you, your home. I'm just
bring them here.
Yeah.
Bring not bring them to their home. Bring them to a foreign country.
To your home. Okay, sorry, English is my third language. It's not my first. It's not an either-or solution. I don't see it that way. You mentioned numbers that I'm not sure about. I mean, the UK has taken so far 216 Syrian refugees.
No, we've taken 5,000 asylum seekers, people who have
people who are already here.
No,
people who are already here.
Well, they got here.
They got here, which brings me to my other point. Precisely, how are people arriving here? What are the routes that they are arriving here? Can't we not provide safe routes for people to come here instead of pushing them into going on boats? This is another point I want to make. Also, just to go back into writing checks. So you're saying that it's better to keep on sustaining refugee camps in Lebanon, which you said hosts now a huge number of refugees and can't sustain it. What's the difference between bringing refugees then to Lebanon than bringing them to the UK?
Let me explain.
I know you're going to tell me like they're going to start a life again in another country. However, please allow me to finish my points first. Aid money should be sustainable. A lot of this money is, I mean, Sarah spoke about, you know, how efficient is, I mean, this is not the first time that we've seen such a crisis, but it seems like, as usual, we are dealing with this as if it's the first time that we are dealing with such a crisis, because the local, when the locals come and say we need education for these children in 2012, it takes a whole year for, you know, the international organizations to say, oh, actually, we need education for these children. The majority of the money is going into barely sustaining these refugees, not into development, not into giving them a dignified sense of life. Even arriving in the UK or in the European countries is not in really dignified ways. I've been in closed rooms where numbers have been discussed and divided between countries. Oh, I prefer to have actually, 2% from these refugees to be gay. Oh no, actually Christians. You know what? We need doctors and engineers in this country. You know, this is a matter of right, not a matter of picking and choosing the right refugees to come in which country. And I think before, that's it for now. I have more to
Thank you. And I'm going to give you plenty of opportunities to reply to that. But I do think there's one issue that you raised, which is really an important one, which is, is at the heart of some of the horrible things we're seeing, which is this, lack of humane and efficient processing of asylum claims at the appropriate points in the system, which is driving many people into very high-risk environments. I want to welcome an addition to the panel, which is Lord Williams, who's a former UN Undersecretary General. Lord Williams, if you don't mind, what I'm going to do, I'm going to just take a few questions from the floor first, and then I'll give you an opportunity to get a sense of the discussion and bring you in. So I'm going to take questions in groups 3 or 4, depending on their brevity. So let's start over here.
Hi, my name's Katie, and I'm from the International Refugee Trust. My question, and this is open to any of the panelists to answer, where do you think we're going to be in this situation in a year's time, and where would you like us to be? We've talked about, safe routes to passage, how many refugees in the UK, what we're doing with refugees in Jordan and Lebanon. What do you think the situation will be, and what would you like it to be?
Okay, please. If you remember to say who you are.
Okay, my name's Tahir Zaman from SOAS, University of London. This is a question directed to Andrew. You mentioned that the safe havens are going to be located around Daraa and the Turkish border, and it strikes me that's where the regime doesn't hold any sort of territory. And given that the regime is responsible for 90% of deaths inside Syria up until 2014, and this year 70% of deaths are attributable to the regime, what would happen to areas like Zabadani, Doma, Ghouta Sharqiya, Daraya, which have been devastated, reduced to rubble, primarily because of the regime's insistent use of barrel bombs indiscriminately against the civilian population?
Thank you. Over this way.
I came here today because I kind of wanted to get some better answers than the majority of ways that pundits have been discussing the issue in the press over the last week or so. And I mean, I agree with Stephen that I don't think it's helpful to play the blame game, to look back, but that we should look forward. And in that respect, I mean, I think the thing that worries me most about this crisis is our conception of what our duty is, or lack of conception of what our duty is. 0.7% of the right thing does not give a right answer to a grave and serious question. I'm quite worried by Andrew's gung-ho-ness to put boots on grounds and guns in places and no-fly zones, none of which have worked in other conflicts this current period of crisis in the Middle East. I really worry that we lack, Britain today, as a development community, lack the moral language to work out how it is we go about deciding what our duty is. And actually, I think, in the government's response and in Europe's response to that crisis, all of those mechanisms that should give us those answers have failed, and I think that's the thing we should all be angry about.
So I'm going to take one more question, please. Actually, I was just here.
Yeah, I'm Uni Krishnan. I work with Plan International. It looks like there are certain things coming up which might lead to some changes in the existing policies related to refugees, asylum seekers, and so on. So I would like to listen to, actually, Andrew Mitchell, where do you see the risk when these changes are likely to happen? Some of these policies will get further diluted rather than becoming in favor of the people who are seeking asylum, as well as refugees and others. And especially working with the government in the past, do you have any tips for the international NGOs and others? What will actually make the government to perform better rather than dilute some of these policies?
Okay, I don't want Andrew to have to fill all,
Well, do you want me to,
all
do
of
you
the
want me to have a
questions.
crack
but
at them first?
Please, yeah.
If I have a crack at them first, then people can come back.
Yeah.
I mean, on Katie's question about a year's time, I'm an optimist, and I think if people speak out about the importance of taking serious action on the causes of all of this, and I appreciate that we're not only talking about that tonight, then in 1 year's time, I think the other camps, which at the moment are suffering 50% reduction in funding and at the risk of incurring Ruba's wrath, are in the state which she described in the Lebanon, where you need more facilities. I think they will be properly funded. I think that the policy of setting up at least 2, maybe 3 safe havens will be well advanced. I think that the political process, which is what will end all of this in the end, will be starting to gather pace with those who have influence over the protagonists in Syria, getting those people to Geneva. I think the flow of migrants across the sea, people who put themselves into the modern equivalent of the slave traders' hands in the hope of tipping up on a more prosperous European shore, that trade will have stopped. People will be being looked after either in the safe havens or in the camps, and a feeling of optimism that this appalling catastrophe is turning round will be there. That is the optimistic view. Anything short of that continues to underline the failure of the international community in all of this. The point about safe havens and deaths and the worry about whether they would work. I mean, you're completely right. If you look at the appalling killing rate in July and August, it's right up, it's well up, and 85% of that is from the regime, and an awful lot of that is from the barrel bombs, which is why, if you could have a no-fly zone, which is completely different from safe havens, a no-fly zone is participating in the conflict. It's having a dog in the fight, if you like. Completely different from safe havens, which is a humanitarian measure, which would be under the United Nations. So there's no doubt in your analysis. The question is what we do to try and stop that. And in my view, it is to engage in getting these safe havens in a permissive environment. And there's nothing in it for the Russians to oppose a strong international will through the UN for humanitarian support and relief for these people, and Assad's got enough on his plate without fighting, without getting into conflict with a very heavily armed protective force in those safe havens.
But Andrew, sorry if I can just interrupt. Isn't the point that's being made that for safe havens to be effective, they need to be located in areas precisely where the regime would have an interest?
Well, the northern. I mean, I've made it very clear that I am suggesting, because it's not fair to come up with these ideas and not think them through and have ideas about them. But I am suggesting two locations. There's a third location, which is a sort of Kurdish enclave as well. The northern one near the Turkish border is largely, but not wholly, under the control of the Free Syrian Army. But where the right location is, that's for experts to decide. What I'm saying is that civilians who are displaced within Syria, which is nearly half the country, need somewhere they can go inside their own borders as well as over their borders, where they can be kept safe, and that's the argument for safe havens. In terms of the fourth point I was asked, about change in policy. The government, there's no doubt the government is beginning to think about ways of intervening to address these causes. But my point is that it's up to us, it's up to civil society to press governments to get on with trying to tackle these causes and not accept no for an answer and drive these arguments forward. And I hope very much that the sort of change you'll see is one which conforms with that and improves the ability for that.
Thank you, Andrew. Stephen.
So I think it was a great first question. It picks up the same one you raised about what's our duty. So I want to focus it in relation to where we might be in the UK. I think at the moment there's a sense that the national desire to welcome refugees is vastly greater than the supply of refugees. And one of the things that I've been quite keen to highlight to people is that there are already 25,000 asylum seekers and refugees coming to Britain every year. And one of the messages I think is really important to people is, if you're in Oxford, go and see Asylum Welcome, a small charity in Oxford that already works with destitute asylum seekers in that town. If you're in Derby, go and see the organisation that works there. There are organisations up and down this country working with refugees. You don't need to be lobbying a politician to bring somebody from the region to work with refugees and asylum seekers in Britain. You don't need just to send a blanket to Calais. You could go and give a blanket to somebody who's in the same town as you. So I think that a year from now, I'd like to see a Britain where we are welcoming and supporting refugees who come here through whichever means, and there would be, obviously, I'd also like to see many more safe and legal routes. And I see no reason why the UK, for instance, couldn't welcome 10,000 refugees over the next 12 months. I think we have the capacity for that kind of step change, but we should do it in response to need. I was at a meeting this morning at the Home Office, and where UNHCR were there. UNHCR launched a call and asked the international community to resettle 130,000 Syrians based on their assessment of who was in refugee camps and had those needs, and they launched that at the end of 2013. So we're here now, and so far 104,000 of those places has been taken up, and they're people coming from camps. So you can't count the people who came through asylum as scoring against that assessment by UNHCR of people with need. The only assessment contribution for the UK is the 218, and we should step up.
Okay, hold that one and we'll come back to it. Michaela, just to give a sort of Brussels spin on the first question, I mean, what's the good case scenario for the European response in a year's time?
Well, the good case, the better case scenario would be for heads of state to agree on Juncker's package of proposals next week. And in fact, it pleases me to no end to see some of the member states coming round. So Ireland, for example, has an opt-in to the asylum, the common asylum policy. So it is not part of Schengen, but it can opt in. And Ireland has now decided to actually opt in to the Commission's proposed quotas. So they're going to accept 3,000 asylum seekers. So there is some movement. There's still a lot of dissent from the Visegrad states, Poland, Hungary, and so on. But it's likely they'll be outvoted in the Council. The voting is qualified majority. I'm quite optimistic that it will go through. And there are some good proposals being put forward. This common list of safe countries of origin, that's going to really move forward. And the hotspots, which will be in Italy and Greece, will also help speed up the process. So it's a start, and hopefully, something to build on.
Thank you, Michaela. So, Michael, I hope you've managed to catch your breath now. You probably gathered, so that it's a very wide-ranging discussion. Actually, one of the points that Andrew made right at the outset was this is precisely the type of situation the UN was created to address, to protect people, to resolve conflict. And and I guess as someone who's worked a lot in the UN, that that many people would argue it hasn't come out of it with flying colours.
Not always. Oh, you mean out of the Syrian?
In this particular case. So,
no.
I mean, maybe just if you could just give us your reflection on the performance of the UN system.
Well, look, UN is doing an enormous amount on the ground in the humanitarian field with the refugees in Jordan and Lebanon and so on. In terms of political and military action, it can do what the Security Council asks it to do. And I'm afraid the Security Council is still bitterly divided on the issue of Syria. Now, I was involved first in the UN in the 1990s, in missions in Cambodia and in the Balkans. On both of those issues, the Council was united. So, and by the way, we dealt with bad people, as it were, the Khmer Rouge. They were a party to the agreement that brought peace to Cambodia. That's important to remember. They killed a lot more people than Bashar al-Assad, I can tell you, and in far worse circumstances. Making peace is a bit like Bismarck talked about making laws. You don't want to see what goes into it, just as you don't want to see what goes into sausages. It's a messy and very, very ugly business. But the question has been raised about safe havens and no-fly zones, and I have mixed feelings about both, and good and bad examples from the Balkans. So the Balkans wars, as you know, started in '92. They raged on until '98. Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo, and that's a bad example of how slow the international community was here in the heart of Europe, not in Syria, in the Middle East. But in '93, I think it was, Security Council backed a NATO sort of mandate for no-fly zones. A little while later, the Serbs flew 4 fighter bombers over a Serb enclave in Croatia. NATO shot them down. After that, there was never any further aerial action in the Bosnian or Croatian wars. Now, that's the good news. I remind this group of the bad news. The worst massacre in Europe since the Second World War. 6,000 men and boys killed in cold blood in a UN safe area, Srebrenica. And this despite the resolution being there and NATO having a mandate to use force. There was a battalion of Dutch NATO troops there. The Netherlands to this day is scarred by that terrible experience and that terrible blot on its nation's modern history. So I'm not against safe areas, but somebody's got to fight. Somebody's got to fight to defend them against very heavily armed groups and to take casualties. And if I'm honest, I do not see the political will in Western countries to undertake that. President Obama is now going into his final year of office. I think it highly unlikely, barring unforeseen circumstances, something dramatic could happen, that he is going to embark on something like this. And the idea of Europe doing on its own, that only gets a sharp negative answer. I don't want to add to the gloom, but you've got to rigorously analyse things before you get solutions. And there's been a dangerous development to make a situation even worse than it was. That is that Turkey is back at war with the Kurds.
Can I just make one point on that?
Please.
I mean, everything you say about the dangers for a no-fly zone are true, but just 2 points. First of all, you know, the appalling legacy of Srebrenica. I think we've learnt that now. And secondly, you know, boots on the ground. They're not offensive; they're defensive, as you made clear. But ideally, they should not be Western boots, let alone American boots, which are a sort of magnet for quite a number of the groups to come along and attack them. Ideally, they should be boots from the region, but they should be supported very strongly by Western equipment and so forth, so that they are seen as an overwhelmingly powerful force, which there's no point in engaging with. That would be the point, I think. But I mean, I fully accept that all your points are true, but this is an unprecedented situation.
I agree.
Which is the worst catastrophe we have faced probably since the Second World War.
I agree. And by the way, this has now lasted longer than the First World War, which in itself is an indictment of the international community. But I go back to what I said. You have to fight to protect safe areas. They would be tested. I worry, Andrew, you talk about forces from within the region. From where? The division of the region and the sectarianism is part of the problem.
Well, I think that Jordan, it's not easy, I agree, but it ought to be possible to get people to camp on the ground that this is a humanitarian effort. It's not about prosecuting your various war aims. It is simply about protecting innocent people.
Okay, what I want to do now, we're actually, I realise, skirting out a huge number of issues, but I actually think that reflects the underlying nature of the problem. You know, that without a settlement, this issue is not, you know, the refugee crisis is not going to go away, but we have to deal with the refugee crisis as well. So bear with us, even though we're covering a broad spectrum of issues. Let's take another round of questions. One right at the back.
We're stopping at 6:30 sharp.
Yeah.
I'll try and stay for
Thank you. Great. Is it on? Yes. Claire Spencer, Chatham House. I would like to tackle the issue of the people traffickers, what Andrew, I believe you referred to as the slave traders, which is, as is well known, is now a multinational and multi-million-dollar business. And I think some of us will have seen the coverage by the BBC earlier in this week of how easy and how prevalent it is to track down traffickers in Turkey, who are the ones making the most money out of the misery of Syrians at the moment. And it's not for nothing that where the focus of policy is largely, for the first half of this year, been on stopping the trafficking coming in from Libya to Italy on what's called the Central Mediterranean route. It's now overwhelmingly the Balkans route from Turkey, Greece, etc., where the majority of Syrian refugees are going. Now, given that it's the central plank of the British government's policy to say we're not taking refugees already in Europe because we wish to deter the pull factor, if you like, and actually act against the people traffickers and go to, if you like, the source of the refugees in the camps, what exactly is the British government and indeed Europeans doing to actually counter this massive business as well as criminal activity, which is people trafficking?
Okay, thank you, Claire. And then one in the front row here. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Jean-Paul Penrose. It's a question for Andrew. The government committed in its manifesto to increasing the UK aid match programme. And I spent some time at the weekend trying to sort of make a donation under the UK aid match, and it wasn't possible to do so, or it wasn't clear at all how to do so. So it's just a question, really, can you push the government to speed up so that the wave of support and empathy towards the crisis could actually sort of capture UK public spirit and intent to provide finance?
Just so actually, Andrew isn't here.
No, it's fine. No, but I said that as an MP who can push the government.
I'm not a member of the government, but I can try and give you
so two people along? Thanks.
Hi, yes, I'm Monica from Between Borders. Given the EU ministerial meeting coming up, is there a sense of what will happen with the Dublin Convention?
Thank you. And then one right here.
I'm James Cameron. I'm chairman of the ODI.
Yeah.
I'd like to try and take the safe haven idea, but ask Rupa how something might function or not inside Lebanon, where I grew up and I have a strong emotional connection with. I'm in favour of the idea of safe havens. Many years ago, I wrote the General Assembly resolution for the Kurdish safe haven, and I believe in them in principle. But I'm anxious that Lord Williams and Sarah might well be right on the practicality of putting together the right forces, given the sectarian divisions, and I'm struggling to see who does the work of the creating the security. And I'm also concerned to see Lebanon cope with the sheer scale of the refugees there, and particularly in what we discussed earlier, which is the absolute lack of proper educational facilities and the ability for people to look after themselves when they get to Lebanon. So I'd just be interested to know how Ruba treats the safe haven idea and whether there is something that could be done in Lebanon that would be practical.
So Ruba, if you could store that one for when we sum up, and then I'm going to take one last question here. So, please, front row.
I can speak. Hi, Carmen from MSF UK. Thanks for, particularly to Sarah, for mentioning how this crisis is a protracted one, and Ruba as well. But I just wanted to flag up that actually we are in a state of emergency, and we're seeing, absolutely horrendous conditions on the shores of Italy and Greece. And my question is, one, to Lord Williams, does UNHCR plan to step up its game in terms of reception centres, in terms of reconnecting families, for example? And then also to Andrew, who continuously reminds us that we're only seeing 3% of the people who are affected. What is 3% and why can't we take them here in the UK?
Okay, thank you. So we've got around 10 minutes. So I'm going to ask each of the panellists to, I think there's a fairly obvious division of labour here. Andrew, safe havens dominated a lot of the discussion, and I guess what this comes down to is two things, really, isn't it? It's the practicalities on the ground, the balance of forces on the ground, and whether you really feel that the locus has shifted in the Security Council sufficiently to make this feasible.
Okay, well, only I think question 4 dealt directly with safe havens, but let me try and deal with that. The question of the right troops to defend these safe havens is, I completely agree, a complex one for the reasons that have been said. But under United Nations auspices, there are very experienced troops who can be deployed. I think of some of those who've worked elsewhere in the world. It doesn't have to be regional troops. I said regional troops because I was trying to make it clear that it shouldn't, in terms of boots on the ground, ideally it should not be European troops, although they can help with training and logistical support and equipping and so forth, and advice. I don't think it should be ideally them, and that's why I said troops from the region. But there's a very strong cohort of particularly Pakistani troops and Indian troops who worked extremely well together in some parts of the world.
In DRC.
And the UN Department for Peacekeeping is very experienced, and if the hurdle of the Security Council could be got over on the grounds that this was a humanitarian act and not prosecuting the war in Syria, if that could be got over, I think that the right troops would be quite easily found by the DPKO, I think.
Thank you. Stephen, there's actually an online question directed specifically to you, which I'll relay, which is it's a question about the Gateway Protection Programme and whether there isn't a better way of ensuring that refugees have an opportunity to link to their communities and families when they enter the UK. I don't understand the question particularly because it's not my area, but I'm hoping you can.
I can give you a 30-second explanation of how Gateway works. So the UK resettles 750 refugees a year. The funding primarily comes from the European Union. The contract is between the Home Office and local authorities who volunteer to be a part of this. And those local authorities say, I'd like to have a voluntary sector organisation. We have 20 staff in Manchester. They work with 500 refugees and about 100 people volunteer with Refugee Action to support those people during their first 12 months. So it's volunteers that take them to their house on the first day. It's volunteers that show them where the GP is. It's volunteers that help them to register with their kids into school. It's volunteers that help them to write their first CV. So this very small scheme we currently have in the UK draws enormously on the goodwill of people in those areas to help them, and critically also, although there's very little resource for it, to help make sure that there are good connections made between the communities into which they go, because clearly there are risks around integration, particularly depending on which countries people come from and the kind of skills and experience that they've got. So can I just, do you want me to close too?
If you unless you're going to be very brief on the next point, yes. But if you can be brief,
Okay.
please, you've got another minute.
I'll be very brief. The country, somebody from Save the Children said this morning to the Home Office, the country has an emotional need to see refugees landing in this country very soon. And I think that's true. And I think that when it happens, they are going to be welcomed by thousands of people. But I also think, as I said, we need to do it in response to need. But the final thing I want to say is that, as I said, there are 25,000 asylum seekers arriving in Britain every year. We can't create a two-tier system between the Syrian person who is resettled from a refugee camp and the Syrian person who arrives having made an incredibly perilous and dangerous journey, not because traffickers persuaded them to do it, but because they're desperate people with no alternative. So we cannot have a two-tier system. We need support for asylum seekers when they arrive, whichever program they arrive through.
Stephen, thank you. Sarah.
Well, maybe just to pick up from Steve, I think you alluded to the traffickers' issues, and that's in addressing Claire's question as well. I think there is a bit of a mythology about what the traffickers do and how much the traffickers are part of the problem. The traffickers respond with demand. It's very clear. The migrants and the refugees are consumers in this. They choose them, they assess them, they check, through networks, through families, through those who've done the journey before, through social media, who to use. Their networks are very fluid. Smuggling networks are fluid. They're capable to adapt to changing policies much faster than the government are going to put in place measures to block them. And we need to recognize until there are more legal, safer ways for people to move, they will be there to provide a passage for people who want to get here. And people want to get to places where there are networks. I think that's the other thing that we need to bear in mind. It's not that they come here because there are benefits. They're here because they have families, because they have networks, because they have connections that they feel they can use to reestablish a new life with dignity. And that's really my last point. I think that's something that is really lacking from our debates. Dignity. These people are human beings. These people, we have a shared humanity with them. It's really absent from the way in which we talk about refugees and migrants. I think it's really imperative to bring that back into our conversations.
Yeah, very, very good point. Michaela, the Dublin agreement, inevitably, I was surprised it took so long, but there you go. Do you want? I mean, maybe do you want to take that as a lead in, and if there are other points you want to raise?
Sure. I don't have a sense of what's going to happen to it, but I know it's under review next year, 2016. Yeah, that remains to be seen. But I just wanted to pick up Sarah's point, and actually, the fact, what we've seen is that refugees opt for dangerous journeys because actually EU visa policies are just, completely prevent them from entering the EU anyway. So, and at the end of the day, visa policies are a competence of the member states. So until the member states can, look at allowing for, easier access, safer access, or at least allow the EU to harmonize the rules around visas, then, smugglers will thrive.
Thank you. Michael.
Going back to Andrew's point, you're absolutely right, Andrew. India, Pakistan, Jordan, they all have very good, very professional troops. I've worked with them in several peacekeeping missions. It needs a DPKO can only act on the basis of a Security Council resolution. That is absent, and I could not give you any encouragement that it would be early and forthcoming. I think one of the problems of Syria, to be blunt, is we've forgotten about diplomacy. Forgotten about it. We're talking amongst friends. You have to talk to those who are bitterly opposed to you, sometimes to the length that you could not have imagined. Like being in the room with senior Khmer Rouge figures. Talk about people with blood on their hands. My God, hundreds of thousands. Eventually I was a witness against Milosevic, Mladic, Karadzic, in the tribunals in The Hague, prosecution witness against all of them. This, by the way, is another terrible aspect which is missing from this whole debate. No one talks about justice. No one. No one's raised that flag. We've forgotten about diplomacy, and we need to start rethinking. We need to look again, I think, at the relationship with Russia and also with China. China's always, in the corner there. If Russia moves, the Chinese will probably move. There is an opportunity coming up shortly with the General Assembly meeting in New York, and I think the 21st. I hope that the UK is amongst others that will be calling for a special meeting of the Security Council on the Syrian conflict. But diplomacy is not something you do with your friends. You do it with those you are most bitterly opposed to.
Thank you. It's a really important cautionary note. And you had a couple of points you wanted to come back on? Well, I was going to give Rupert the last word, actually.
Just a couple of points. On the aid match, that was something we set up. It's designed to, when you give money to a specific cause or sport, which we've allocated for aid match, then that will be doubled. But it's about the mechanics. The point. If we just have a quick word afterwards, I'll make sure that point is fed back because it's really important. On the people traffickers. We are trying now to provide intelligence by working with other European agencies so that we can prosecute them and take them out of the picture. It will be very difficult to do, but it's the right approach to these dreadful people who, as I say, are the equivalent of the slave trader. The point about the MSF, about reception centres in Europe, I completely agree, and it is appalling that many of these poor people who come across the sea, they tip up on the sand and wait for a local charity to bring them sustenance and to help them. And the one thing the European Union can do is to centrally provide the money to make sure that the countries where they face this reception centre, where they land, can actually look after them straight away, and much more should be done about that. You asked why we can't take them. Britain's making its contribution in the way that we said. It's making a huge contribution. Let us not pretend that we're going to take hundreds of thousands of refugees into Britain. We're not going to do it, and the country won't stand for it. But we are going to take a number, and we should take a number, and everyone that comes here and is resettled, that, of course, is a good thing. Just final point. I couldn't agree more with what Lord Williams said. Every single word of what he said. You need to talk to people you despise. That is what diplomacy is all about. We need to have that special meeting, but it needs to be prepared for. And Britain has been always one of the negotiators on the Security Council between the different bodies. And we need a supreme effort. It is not there at the moment, a supreme effort to try and get agreement around this humanitarian point. I'll just end on the point about justice, with which I completely agree. I remember on a National Security Council discussion in Britain in 2012, the critical importance of the Foreign Office cataloguing those who can be held to account when all this is over. Heavily armed troops attacking innocent civilians. Those who can be photographed. Mobile telephony, hugely important now in photographing people who are complicit in acts of violence against civilians. And the Foreign Office has been collecting these and is documenting them, so that at the end of the day, the point that Lord Williams makes about justice can be honoured.
Thanks, Andrew. Last word for you.
Thank you. About the safe haven, I mean, I don't know if I can answer that question properly because I haven't researched it properly, but I must say that my first feelings, I agree a lot with what Lord Williams have said about it. I'm not sure Lebanon can take on more responsibility, and especially in such a sectarian country where it's really difficult to defend even the refugee camps. Every week we have tents that have been, put into fire, etc. So I don't know how, viable that option is. I just want to say, I'm just going to wrap everything up in the answer to the question, where would we like to be in 1 year? Of course, the violence should stop. Violence should stop, meaning diplomacy, meaning pushing the UN Security Council, meaning stopping weapons into going to wrong hands, just stopping the violence, listening to local organizations like Planet Syria and others who are asking for demands to stop the violence, of course. However, this is not either or, as I said before. We need to think about, which answers the question about, traffickers. It answers the question about the Dublin Convention, even if it was like Germany has done, stopped for, didn't use the Dublin Convention anymore. We have to look for legal routes. We have to look for safe routes. We have to look for fair resettlement plans. We have to increase the search and rescue money, not to police people on borders, but actually to help them, survive. Finally, we talk a lot about tax money but for example, on the 12th of September, which is this Saturday, there's a march in London that I urge everyone to be there to say refugees are welcome in this country. And this march has been started by one civilian in this country who isn't only wanting to satisfy her emotional need to see people coming into this country, but has actually gotten in touch with her humanity, that actually these people need to arrive here in more safer ways. So I urge everyone, there are 85,000 people that the government will have to respond to just in London if they decide that they don't want to bring any more people into this country. I invite everyone to invite your friends and join us on Saturday on this march. Thank you.
And I'd like to second that. So as many of you who can be there, be there. Just a few thoughts to wrap up. I'm really struck by the debate between Andrew and Lord Williams, actually, that that often in the development community, I think we don't think enough about the politics and the foreign policy and the security discussions. And it does seem to me there's a space there that ODI, Chatham House, Russi, and others ought to be filling to sort of really bring together those different areas. On the region, which we've touched on at various times, it really strikes me that if you look at the response, Sarah made the point that I know for Lebanon, 2/3 of the UNHCR appeal is still unfunded. And if you understand, in terms of the most basic provision of education and health facilities, this is the reason. And it does seem to me, that the sort of resourcing that we're directing to refugees in the region are so misaligned with demand and needs on the ground that really we need a Marshall Plan for the region, actually. This ought to be about how do we provide education for every child in the region, health and so on. And I think we know that some of the cash transfer programs that have been introduced have been very successful and could be scaled up. On the trafficking issue, which has come up a lot, trafficking is securing rent from human misery by exploiting the discrepancy between supply and demand. That's basically what it is. And you need to take the floor out of the market. And the way the floor was taken out of the market for the Vietnamese boat people was a huge resettlement program, a commitment to resettle, which created incentives to process asylum claims more.
The difference between trafficking and slavery is that there was no demand for slavery, right? So
yeah. We'll continue this discussion over wine after. And actually, the last point I wanted to make, behave, guys. We're going to close down anything. I'll come to you just 1 second. Sarah used the point. I think used the words empathy and humanity, and I think this is really about the movement of people and the dignity of people. One of the programs that we're developing in ODI, actually, is not just on Syria, but is to try and understand this, because most people who move in the world aren't moving to Europe. I mean, they're moving from the Horn of Africa to the Middle East, across Africa, and I think understanding the drivers of human movement and the need for protection and how we provide dignity is really important. And we have a program of work that we're developing here, which Marta Foresti, who's in the front row, if Marta, maybe put your hand up, but those of you who are interested in that we will be developing that and taking that forward. Lord Williams, to my eternal shame, I forgot to invite you to make closing remarks.
Well, the closing remark I wanted to make was about an example of diplomacy which has been very successful recently, namely the nuclear agreement between Iran and the P5 plus Germany.
Thank you.
A long time in the making, and I have no doubt whatsoever that will have an impact, and a positive impact, on the situation in the wider region, including Syria. And I thought I had proof of that today when Khamenei, the supreme leader, said it will have no impact, which means, precisely in the language of these people, that people are having those thoughts. I mean, I know people like Javad Zarif and Abbas Aragchi, the deputy minister. He lived 4 years in Whitstable. These are not mad mullahs. And I think countries like Oman have already played a very interesting role in the US-Iranian dialogue, and I think they're playing some role now with regard to Syria.
Michael, thank you so much for that. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers, to Stephen, Sarah, Andrew, Michael, Yuba, and Michaela. So thank you to everyone and to the audience.